Housing Harlem, Strategies for the Preservation and Rehabilitation of Affordable Housing Stock. We have another all-star lineup, this time of representing viewpoints that we did not have on the previous panel. So if you could give our panelists the same rapt attention that we got for the last panel. We know we're short on time, so I'd like to get us started as soon as possible. That way I don't go over too long. So, once again, if you weren't here for the last panel, my name is Barry Weinberg. I have been chair of the Manhattan Community Board 9, which covers West Harlem, here from 110th to 155th, for the past 4 years. I am terming out at the end of June, and we have our upcoming chair, Victor Edwards, here in the back. You know, we're both local. I had a short jaunt over from 138th Street here, and we're very happy to be having this in our home district at the Spitzer School at City of College. So, without further ado, I will just note once again that State Senator Cordell Clare will not be able to make it because she is still doing the job we pay her to do in Albany at the end of session. So it is not a reflection on her dedication of us, except that she is very dedicated at doing her job. So, without further ado, if I could have a little bit more quiet in the room, please. Shh. We're going to get started here with our next panel, Housing Harlem, Strategies for Preservation and Rehabilitation of Affordable Housing Stock. We have folks on here who have been doing that in their day-to-day lives for years. I want to start by introducing Karim Hudson, who serves as the president and founding CEO of Genesis Companies, who are a multifamily developer here focused, I think, mainly here in Harlem. It was founded in 2004. He has more than 20 years of experience in development, finance, and asset management. And he has preserved and built a large amount of affordable housing right here in Harlem. And so I want to thank him for joining us. Resident of Harlem, very involved in our community. We also have next to him Malcolm A. Punter, who similarly has a great deal of experience coming from a faith-based community development background. Mr. Punter is the, I believe, president and CEO, right, of Harlem. Yeah,
that's correct.
Harlem Congregations for Community Improvement, HCCI, which has a wide portfolio of buildings and land in Harlem, over $550 million worth, and he has led the affordable housing initiatives of HCCI, which has several new construction projects in production, including 135 units of senior housing and 250 cooperative home ownership units. So he has extensive experience in this field, and we welcome his input and experience and wisdom in an area that Councilmember Brewer touched on very briefly at the last panel. And finally, last but not least, we have Tiffany Kahn, who is a board member of the Metropolitan Council on Housing, and up until recently, a member of Manhattan Community Board 9, who served on the Housing, Zoning, and Land Use Committee and the Economic Development West Harlem Peers Committee. She has roots in the Caribbean and Brooklyn, strong Bayesian force on the board, and has extensive international experience abroad working and studying. That has given her a wide-ranging perspective while she focuses up close on the local details. Her advocacy centers around affordable housing, but she views local economic and financial empowerment as being a crucial element in this endeavor. She is also the mother of Athena, the favorite child of CB9, who is now turning 3. Yeah. So proud toddler mom, proud CB9 person, and dear to the community. So, without further ado, let's talk about preserving and rehabilitating affordable housing in Harlem. You know, Harlem is a historic neighborhood on so many different levels, on architecture, on culture, on being the center of Black power and Black imagination in America for much of the 20th century and still in the 21st century. And so I'd like to just start by asking, what does it mean when we talk about preserving and rehabilitating affordable housing in Harlem? What does it look like, and why do we do it?
Is that for me?
Yeah, we're going to go straight down the line.
I just picked the wrong seat. Thank you so much for Thank you so much for having me this morning. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak with all of y'all. And I love your commitment to Harlem and to New York City. And you guys share a love for this work. It sounds like, as I do. I grew up in the Bronx and in Harlem. My family grew up in Harlem, Lincoln Projects to Edgecombe Avenue. And my family, my two daughters are 7 and 10, live here now with my wife. So we're committed. Look, I mean, I think from my perspective, that's a large question. What I focus on in my work is trying to figure out ways to responsibly create communities. I think the most important thing is that housing in Harlem, as well as affordable housing specifically, is aging rapidly. And we have to do something to improve, upgrade, renew the housing conditions that our folks in Harlem live in. You know, I grew up in the Bronx, right by the Cross Bronx Expressway, and like 9 out of 10 of my friends had asthma and all kinds of sick building syndrome issues. That was because of the quality of the building stock, and maybe some neglect by the landlords as well. So I think preserving means getting serious about healthy, sustainable, green housing for people. And I think the flip side of it also is creating the network that allows families to progress within the housing. You know, in affordable housing, we're always talking about let's build more units, and that's great. But I want to see families progress in this housing so it's actually a tool for them to improve their lives. And if we can't figure out how to do that, and we're just focused on all of our little, hallways, which is affordable housing or social services or education, we're not going to do the real big thing, which is creating communities that can thrive for Black and brown communities here in Harlem.
Thank you very much. Mr. Punter.
Yeah, thank you, Barry. Thank you, Karim. Thank you all for being here. As was stated, I'm Malcolm Punter. I serve as the president of HCCI, which is Harlem Congregations for Community Improvement. And I've been in that capacity for about 15 years. But I started my career in real estate development in the for-profit realm. I was trained as an MBA, hold a law degree, and I used that education first in the for-profit realm. And I'm not a for-profit realm critic because I think my training there helps me do what I do now in the non-for-profit sector. In a family office, and that family office started with my father and my brother, and they've done a lot of rehabilitation, and that's where I was trained, and through partnerships with the city. But you know, when I started to look at long-term contributions to the community that I grew up in, born and raised here, married with my children born in Harlem Hospital, a great place for prenatal and birthing. Harlem Hospital is great for two things, birthing and gunshot wounds, unfortunately. But you know, this community is very dear to me, and you know, I often tell people, when you live in a community so long, 50 plus years, third generation, you know, you tend to get complacent, and I give an example. Most people, when they walk down the street, and architects probably try to design to solve this problem, they don't look up, right? They rarely look up. They just look at, you know, what's in front of them, and there's good reason for that, particularly in Harlem in the 70s and 80s. You want to look and see, you know, what's coming at you. But if you look up at a building that HCCI has developed on 145th Street, and you look at the cornerstone on the sixth level, sixth story, you see 1910. So these buildings are more than a century years old, and you know, no matter how many internal rehabilitations you do, it's still 110 plus years old. So preservation is central to the work that we do as affordable housing developers, community advocates, you know, the city of New York, and private developers. So we need to really design our buildings in a way that will be safe in a very long term. And one of the other things that I had experience in is I was the president of the Esplanade Gardens board for 6 years. And they wanted me to serve another 6 years, but I said, no way, you're absolutely insane. I won't do that. But what I learned doing that is that people really care about their homes, and they really need support, and there's a learning curve, and you really have to have a strong set of leaders in the board level to get people to the point where they could feel comfortable and not feel threatened and in fear of losing their homes, particularly when you have environments where people are aging in place. So I'll stop there for now.
Got it. And Tiffany, same question.
When we say historic preservation, that means different things to different people. And just yesterday, I was having a slightly heated discussion with a good friend / fellow Met Council board member about this panel discussion. And he took it to mean these rich folks downtown who care about the copper cornices of their buildings, for example. And for me personally, it's much more than that. We take a look at, for example, the Audubon Theater, which was almost in the pathway of the wrecking ball. And unfortunately, the site of where Malcolm X gave his last speech and where he was assassinated, it's very important for me personally and for my daughter, for example, to walk the streets and point to this theater and say, this is where these events took place. And this is the connection to you and how you fit into this community. And for generations to come, which was not the same fate that Child's Memorial got to enjoy, right? The famous church where Malcolm X was eulogized, the only church that would accept him, by the way. It's much more than brick and mortar. It's also about preserving communities, right? How many of you remember San Juan Hill? Yeah, well, not I, and in fact, realistically, none of us, really, because that was razed to the ground in the 1960s. So, when I was very excited about some of the rezoning efforts, when I first heard about them, and the prospect of having new buildings, opportunity for housing, et cetera, only to be deeply disappointed by this new housing stock being, number one, largely empty. So really, what are we doing? And number two, people who are from these communities, I grew up in Brooklyn, and I can't afford to live in some of those towers that are coming up. So I see preserving some of these century-old buildings as not being mutually exclusive from, you can't have development and historic preservation. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. In fact, I would argue that the preservation of those rent-regulated buildings can help foster affordable housing. Why? Because we know that a rent-regulated apartment, one of the definitions of being rent-regulated is it was constructed before 1974, right? But if you tear one of these homes, or whether it's a 5-story or whatever size building, when you tear them down, they no longer qualify as being that pre-war, or they no longer fall under that definition. Landlords find all sorts of creative ways of deregulating units. They'll say, okay, we'll take this 2 units and turn it into 1, or vice versa, take 1 unit and turn it into 2. So when you change the layout of a structure, when you tear down a building and put up a new one, that stock of affordable housing gets lost. So what does it mean for me personally? Historic preservation is extremely important. And I have more of a Jane Jacobs perspective on community, on the built environment. And so it is my hope, and I will do everything that I can to preserve these buildings, but at the same time, absolutely we have a housing crisis, and it can be solved. My approach is more if you, and all of us who've walked through, not just Harlem, all over New York City, you will find tons of vacant units, whether they are century-old buildings or even some of the newer ones. An article came out in AMNY New York not long ago about how we have more vacant units than there are people in homeless shelters. So if we're being honest about addressing the housing crisis, that can be done. You know, AOC actually came out with an article not long ago about how that number is 3 times. There are 3 times more vacant units than there are people in shelters. So again, these two things don't have to be mutually exclusive. Don't let people pull the wool over your eyes about that.
Thank you, Tiffany. And we've touched on so much in the first question that I'm going to take time to go through each of the things we touched on if I can. But one question I have is, you know, Harlem has not only historically been affordable, depending on your definition, certainly in the 70s, but also it's been the site of some of the worst maintained housing conditions in Manhattan and some of the most, in some ways, abusive landlords. And so what is missing now in terms of being able to rehabilitate housing and make it affordable, or to even conduct the basic maintenance to make these buildings habitable? Is there something in the public realm that we can do more, you know, whether it's legislation or funding or other things, to address that problem and keep the housing for our community habitable and in good quality with the dignity that everybody deserves?
That's a lot to answer. So at Genesis, we have, because we're black developers, we've never gotten the creme de la creme opportunities. We're always fighting for, you know, opportunity even in public settings. So when we talk about landlords, the truth of it is that, you know, the whole Community Redevelopment Act was enacted for the purpose of creating opportunity for black and brown ownership, and not just at the single family level, but also at the entrepreneurial level. And so we can start with saying, let's prioritize some minority developers to own and develop in their communities, who have a stake in the community, who care about it. That's one thing we've been advocating for, and that's what's not having been done enough of historically. And everybody knows if you actually enlarge the pie of people who can provide the housing, there's more innovation and pricing goes down. That's called economics. And so we're doing too much with too few that don't look like the community. The second thing I think is that there's such a thing as too much bureaucracy. Because oftentimes when bureaucrats are doing things, they may have good intentions, but they're afraid of everything. They're afraid you're going to get mad at them. They're afraid I'm going to get mad at them. They're afraid community board's going to get mad at them. And they're legislating and trying to wave around everything, and then nothing can get done, right? Like we can't be, there has to be some evictions, like the lady said, because some tenants are not doing the right thing. At the same time, we don't want to be abusive at all either, right? But you know, we gotta figure out a way to say, look, you know, let's you know, we have this thing called Housing Connector, and we talked about before. I mean, it takes me months and months to get somebody into an apartment. I'm telling you right now, I'm not knocking down buildings and building towers. I'm just literally trying to preserve housing. I got rent regulated housing, and it takes me 2-3 months to get somebody in there. Not because I'm going to sit around and evade the rents. I can't raise the rents. That's not the issue. The issue is too much bureaucracy around putting somebody in a freaking unit. So, like, you know, we can talk about, and we have to stop being policy driven, and let's get to the ground. Like people, you know, we have, you know, aging out of your unit. It's a huge issue, right? Like, you know, rats, huge issue, right? Like I have people who are in rent regulated housing, or in my housing that's affordable. It's not that they're rent burden. they can't turn off the faucet anymore because they've aged out and they have issues with their hands. And I knock on the door, they say we don't need any help. They flood stuff. I call the city knocks on the door and they go away. They said, it's your problem, right? We have folks who have mental health issues. So for me, we've got to get out of our silos. We have to stop thinking academically. But we have to figure out, we have issues. We want to see people progress in our community, not just have housing, but the housing should be a base for you to be able to progress and live a better life. That's the whole purpose of the affordable housing, was to lock in rent so that you can get a job and you progress and your kids can progress. My family, we came from public housing. My mom did everything she could to get me into the best school so that I could have the opportunity to do something. In return, I ended up going to Harvard Business School, starting my own business, and owning a real estate company that they never could have imagined I could have done when I was first born, right? Or they imagined it, I couldn't imagine for myself. And that's why I'm here. So I think we gotta stop being policy-driven, get out of the bureaucracy, understand what we need to do from a community standpoint to grow communities, to grow families, and then we can preserve housing. The issues on the problems is, you're absolutely right. We take over problem buildings that have tons of issues. We do in-place rehab. It takes time for the tenants to trust you. They've been abused for a long time, and we have to figure out a way. And sometimes they're doing the abusing, and we have to sort all that out. We have to get in and tell them, hey, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to do this and that. We're trying to improve it, and we have to focus on doing and funding the right things so that we give a good building envelope, try to create efficiencies, try to create good air and healthy living conditions. And I think the city is coming a long way in that, in what they're doing. I know I'm going long, I apologize. But they're going a long way in trying to do those things, and we need electrification, that's another big thing. I mean, these are all the things that we have to continue to push for, right? We still have people throwing ACs out their units, right? We gotta figure out a way to get HVAC systems on so we get better quality apartments for people who live in this community.
Thank you, Mr. Hudson. It was very comprehensive, so I do not fault you for going. No, please. It was valuable.
No, that's great, Karim. I'm going to approach this question from three time periods. The first time period I'm going to call sort of early Harlem housing history, the middle period, and where we're at now. So, having benefited from being born and raised here in Harlem, I had to transverse going to school when there were 4,000 vacant lots and apartments and abandoned buildings in the Bradhurst area of Harlem, which, north of 139th Street, St. Nicholas to the Harlem River to 162nd Street. And that was a study done by Robert Fullilove from Columbia University, and he's still with us, churning out research. But he said that, this area had over 3,000 vacant and abandoned apartments. So the neglect is not on us, the nonprofits, the community-based organizations, the for-profits. It was neglected, right? And it was purposefully done that way. And it was based upon racist housing policies and disinvestment from the banking community. CRA wasn't the banks being benevolent, they were forced to do that. And they need to be forced to continue to do that because they will revert back to their old habits. So, the city of New York, starting primarily with the Koch administration, then the Dinkins administration, and all the other administrations knew that they had to do something. And when HCCI was formed in 1986, the ministers went to David Dinkins, who I think was the borough president at the time, or in the city council, and Mayor Koch, and those programs that HPD now are taken for granted by us were formed. And because they were formed because there was a gross need of neglect. We know that New York City was on the verge of bankruptcy in the 70s and early 80s, right? And we went through the oil crisis, right? I was in the car as a toddler or a young person with my father, standing on lines, and they had to, you had to come based on your license plates one day and the other day on 145th Street. The community was in devastation, right? And those buildings that were, I guess, 95 years old at the time were in utter destruction. It was like a Beirut in Harlem. Many of us don't either choose not to reflect on that, or we're just too young to understand that that was the condition. We've done a lot of work since then. HCCI itself, along with its sister agencies and other partners, we've redeveloped over 5,000 units of housing. West 148th Street between Adam Clayton Powell and Frederick Douglass, and I live right across the street. They were throwing sinks and bathtubs out the window at the police cars because of the frustration of the conditions of the housing that we were living in. Not because they didn't like the police, but when you put people in distress in that way through systematic neglect, what are they going to do? Right? And that's why people became crack dealers in Harlem, because they had no other economic alternative, so they thought, or based upon their experiences. So all of that kind of came into a situation where it was a perfect storm. But now, you know, we started to become a little more conscious and innovative, you know, through the civil rights movement and such. You know, we kind of became enlightened and started to work together and to try to bring food programs like the Black Panthers and the Young Lords on the east side of Harlem. And then, you know, the government adopted those and implemented those in public schools, you know, the breakfast programs. So now, you know, what I think that preservation is best done is when everybody kind of comes together and works together, not pointing the fingers at them, pointing the fingers at me, saying we're not doing the right thing, as such. So that was the first kind of historic period of what the conditions were here, the lived environment at the time, if you will. Around 2008, with the Great Recession, you know, something else happened, because HPD and HCR and the government was working with local-based organizations, CBOs, and neighborhood entrepreneurs like Karim. And then we started to recapture the buildings and redevelop them, and slowly but systematically. But in the Great Recession of 2008, you know what happened? All of the Wall Street bankers who were downsized reinvented themselves into become developers. And you know what? They had a partner in Mayor Bloomberg. So all of the community development shifted from CBOs, church-led groups, you know, mosques, temples, to neighborhood entrepreneurs, to now these reconstituted, you know, interests from Wall Street that, you know, they came off of Wall Street with all the money that they slipped out of there with. And now, you know, all of the development became, you know, targeted to those groups. And that's when you see the rapid gentrification. I'm a student of Neil Smith, all right? And so that's when rapid gentrification happened along Frederick Douglass Boulevard, okay? Because our family was building and rehabbing buildings right on 8th Avenue in 2001, 2, and 3. But then there was this explosion. You know, they started to say it's Soha, Bradhurst Lane, you know, big towers, right? But that was because of the tension, because of what happened on Wall Street, because of the mortgage-backed instruments that were created to destroy the housing industry in our country. And none of the Wall Street people were held accountable, right? No one. Absolutely not. They said, oh, you know, countrywide, it had to be reconstituted and bought out by Bank of America. That's not accountability. So now fast forward, you know, there's a lot of competition in who's going to be leading the redevelopment in our community. Whether it's tenant associations now, you know, finally inheriting their buildings after being promised from TIL program for 40, 50 years. I have a resident on East 129th Street. She's 96 years old. She just closed on her co-op that we redeveloped after 96 years in her life. She was waiting 40 years. But you know what? She said she wanted her apartment. She wanted to own her apartment. And the next thing she said, she needed estate planning. So this is how long she was waiting for that to happen. So what I think we need to do is, I think there needs to be a readjustment. We need to readjust as you know, and I differ from Karim in this. You know, I think policy is an avenue to making sure that we have growth and appropriate development, but we need to do it in a smart way where we're talking to the local developers, the people who live in the community, that's not taking the money out and going to Launch March or upstate New York or somewhere else. And now you have international players looking at Harlem, out of the UK and other countries, but really the regulator around, the developers should be from the community, and everybody in the community, as it is now, as diverse as it is now, that's who should be participating in the development of Harlem and the surrounding Bronx communities.
Thank you. Tiffany, public policies?
I think the problem that Karim was touching on about, stop policy-driven approaches, the problem isn't necessarily the policy, it's smart policies. And we tend to celebrate when we finally get relief. We in the public finally have some program or some initiative that's passed, and we stop there. And we can't stop there. We have to... Okay. We have to be that watchdog. We have to continuously monitor when a piece of legislation is passed, how is it being implemented? Is it being implemented? Are there certain people that are profiting more than others? Let's take a look at the TIL program, for example. I think it was 1978 when it came about. That was an amazing program for a lot of HDFCs today that were able to get their buildings converted from TIL to HDFC. But I know of other TIL buildings personally. You mentioned a friend who's someone who's 96. I also have a friend, not that old, but she has been waiting for her building to go from being TIL to HDFC. And to this day, the city promised, if you move out of the building, we will rehabilitate that building and you can move back in and graduate to becoming a full-fledged shareholder. That promise has not been granted. Instead, the city has sold the building to a for-profit corporate real estate developer or what have you. Not a developer, I think it was a corporate real estate landlord. In either case, it is tantamount to theft. And we see this a lot. I think there have been too many missed opportunities. They say on the other side of a crisis, there's opportunity. Absolutely, except we are not the ones that are taking advantage of these opportunities. It's the Wall Street types that you've mentioned that are exploiting them and profiting enormously from them. Some of those buildings that could have been rehabilitated, there are ways that we can fund these programs. We have J51, that it's expired. J51 is controversial for some, and I can see why. And this, by the way, is the reason why we have an almost this double think, this cognitive dissonance to how we look at things like J51, which can be horrible for some and wonderful others. One of my previous landlords is one of those awful actors that used the J51 tax abatement, did not invest anything in renovating his building, and it nearly burnt to the ground in 2014, and it resulted in a tremendous fire eviction, which is happening right now. It's still happening. We hear about the Bronx burning. It's not just the Bronx. It's the Lower East Side, parts of Brooklyn, and right here in Harlem. So why are these bad actors that do receive J51 tax abatements to renovate their buildings and not doing them, why are they not being held accountable? Why is the city, for example, not imposing fines, hefty fines, that in which case those fines could be used in other programs to help the small landlord? For example, we remember that there's a wonderful documentary that came out called The Decade of Fire. And in that documentary, we saw residents in the Bronx who bought sheetrock, plywood, and started renovating their own buildings. Maybe the city could help. I think a lot of people would enjoy taking part in that sort of sweat equity and being implements of change. Maybe the city could fund a program like that if we were to find landlords, especially the larger corporate landlords, who are not maintaining their buildings well.
So, yes.
I guess you're right. It has to be practical policy. But my issue right now with the way policy is being made is that we're trying to avoid the evils, and we're not like getting anything done, right? Like I get all of the issues, right? The guy's at J51, he's abusing it. But I mean, even I'll take the example of like leasing up units in like HPD regulated housing, regulatory agreements. This is not like, I get a big boost if somebody leaves. They're so concerned about somebody cheating the system. Like somebody being able to somehow get the unit when they shouldn't get it. That like they've created so much red tape that like we can't do anything. And so I'm just saying, like I'm fine for the policy. Obviously, I understand it's necessary, but you can't be so afraid of something bad happening or the 10% or the 20% or whatever that you just can't get the other 80% good done. You can't even get to decent, right? And that's the issue that we have, and that's the issue that I have with the way we're forming policy, with the advocate community, with the landlord community. Is, on the city, is that we're always trying to avoid, and we're not, and we have to, and I feel like my only issue as well, a lot of the advocates I talk to in affordable housing aren't from these communities. I sit there and listen to them, and they're doing their research papers, and they have no idea what it means like to live here. And so what are they gonna tell me about what should be happening in this community, right? And I'll just say one thing, listen, my mom did everything. My dad died when I was 3. She remarried. I got a great education. I went to Wall Street, and I got trained. And I was a Goldman banker. I went to private equity, and you know what I learned? I learned how to like make financial sense of investments. I figured out how to okay, I can see something in a building or a property that doesn't look right. I can figure out a way to make it financially sustainable and still do the right thing. So I think it's not about always like, oh, where you're from or these labels we want to put on people. It's like where your values, where your heart is, and what you're trying to get done. And so to me, that's important.
Michael, I see your hand. We're going to hold questions till the end of the panel again. But everybody has touched on and said the word community. And Karim, you talked about breaking down silos between housing, between social services, between preservation. And I'm going to do a bad job as moderator here, but I want to have kind of this interlaced conversation in that, part of Housing Harlem in this panel is, I think, trying to get to the idea of keeping Harlem Harlem while improving it. And so we have questions of economic development and who benefits from this transformation. We have questions about health. Why are health outcomes so bad in Black and brown communities? Well, it doesn't help that there's mold and truck depots and environmental racism affecting it. And then also something that was mentioned, you mentioned Mr. Punter, she's like, the next thing I need is an estate planner. Both the small landlord and the, smaller community-led developers and till tenants, all of them are trying to build generational wealth that has been denied, residents of Harlem, Black residents throughout America for hundreds of years. And so I guess my question is, if you can think prospectively about the way Harlem should be housed and the way we bring housing up to dignified standards and increase affordable housing and preserve our historic architecture. It's a complicated question. It's got too much going on, but I'm trying to break the silos. What would your path to that be if you got to run the world? And I'm sad we don't have an HDFC co-op person on this panel because I would love to get that, and I might ask you, Mr. Punter.
Well, the housing development that I've been privileged to provide over 15 plus years working with HCCI has been primarily production through low-income housing tax credits. And as you may know, that law is relatively recent, right?
Charlie Rangel.
Charlie Rangel, President Reagan signed it into law, and it was a bipartisan bill sponsored, and by and large, the United States Congress still seems to be committed to that. The low-income housing tax credit was codified in the Tax Reform Act of 1986. And that's when most of the CBOs were formed, because there was a real vehicle to redevelop the existing housing stock. It wasn't for new construction initially. So by its nature, it was a preservation program or a preservation vehicle, finance vehicle, if you will. So all of the buildings along Frederick Douglass Boulevard, 145th Street up to 155th Street, with the exception of one or two, are all preservation projects. And what's gratifying to me is we do have several generations in these low-income buildings. And recently one of the residents said, her daughter graduated from college, and is going to graduate school for a law degree, and she said, quite poignantly, that the reason why she's doing that is because of the safe, affordable housing that we provided, and that she was immensely grateful. Because I live in that neighborhood, I have these interactions in the grocery store a lot of times. I get other types of interactions too. Give me more heat, and what are you doing? Guys don't have this elevator fixed, but it's still okay because I'm in my community doing work that I know is real and relevant, and people can see, touch, and interact with me, and I could do that with them. I could have perhaps run away and went to the suburbs like many of us did, but I want to be here. So, this is in lockstep with what I want to do, and I'm committed to doing. So I think organizations like us and other organizations that some of these buildings have become HDFCs, is an example of preservation at work. So, I think we have to temper our criticism in a way that says, there's no preservation, nobody's for preservation. Yes, we are. It's right, the proof is in the production, right in the communities that we have. The other thing about HDFCs is that, I'm frustrated because there's no pattern by the city government, HPD, in making sure HDFCs are equally have a chance to convert to co-ops. Some groups, HDFCs, are converting quite well. I'll give you an example. 110th Street and Adam Clayton Powell, that HDFC, they were able to convert, and there was no regulations, no regulatory agreement capping their pricing. Right. They made out good, and I'm happy for them. They were Harlem residents. They were there for X amount of years, but they're sitting on a real apartment with value that they can pass on their generational wealth to. But on 151st, they don't have that same privilege. I don't know why, but I think it's unfair. Because they're saying you can't sell it for anything, it's a flip tax, this, that, and the other. Heavily restricted, but on 110th Street, right on the corner, Central Park, for some reason it's not. I don't know. So I think that the implementation of the HDFC program, the TIL program, is not created equal. So that's the first criticism that I would have. We have about 5 different construction projects in the Harlem community, and most of our drive has been home ownership of late. An example is PS 90, Public School 90, which was a preservation project, but we converted it to a condominium. Got a lot of criticism about it. We had market rate condominiums and so-called affordable condominiums. 2008, the market was $1 million for a condo that's market, about $500,000 for affordable. Did we get people from the community in those affordable units? Yes. Was it affordable for everybody? No. So, it depends. But we're now building about 75 units through HPD's Open Door program, which is specifically for home ownership. And those are new constructions. One building is on 150th between Frederick Douglass and Bradhurst, and the other is 140th between Adam Clayton and Frederick Douglass Boulevard. And they're almost topped out, so they'll be finished soon. And then we have an old law tenement, 5 buildings. We call that West 139th Street cluster, 139th, 141st, 142nd Street. And those residents with 75 units, Residents will inherit, we've relocated them, and they will go back, and then they will become a tenant-sponsored co-op. So it really depends on the actors, as Tiffany mentioned, whether they will follow through with the promises that are structurally in the programs, the policies, and make sure that the residents get what they were promised. So, I think it's not created equal, but we need to, hold each other to our respective promises and responsibilities. Yeah.
I think how we house Harlem is also how we can house a lot of predominantly communities of color across the city. Another amazing woman in West Harlem by the name of Lois Penny, shout out to Lois Penny, was working to save an HDFC in Brooklyn. 952 St. Mark's Avenue in Brooklyn is an HDFC that in the 1990s should have, converted, and they had a tax abatement, which we discovered. I'm blanking on the name of the program. It was not a J51, but it was one of those very rare tax abatements that would have allowed them to not have to pay taxes, I think it was city taxes, for 40 years. And only now, when Brooklyn is really a hot spot, is this not being respected. So we have a lot of promises that were made to folks in certain areas that were reneged on once those neighborhoods became desirable. And we need to make sure that these government agencies are held accountable. The flip tax that you mentioned, this goes back to the same issue with fear and policies. Flip taxes are important in theory to make sure to prevent speculation, right? We want to ensure that this home is going to be a home used for residential purposes, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, we want to create generational wealth, right? I was able to attend grad school because my mother owned her house. And she was able to get that, I was able to take a cosign on that loan. So we can't create broad sweeping policies that applies to everyone across the city without looking at how different people will be affected. We need policies, again, that are more comprehensive, that study how there might be unintended consequences that hurt more vulnerable groups. So we need people that are willing and able to do that research comprehensively. Not sure if did I answer all of your questions?
There was no way to answer all of my questions, so
Probably.
I'm gonna say two quick
Try to
things,
keep it in a few
because
minutes.
I've been saying I'm talking a lot, but I agree with you on the limited equity, the ANCP, the TIL program. I really don't understand how there's generational wealth being created. I mean, you're saying you're an owner, but you can't sell it because it's capped. And then when I talked to some of the advocates about it, who are friends of mine, I said, why can't these folks sell their homes and make money if they want to move out to North Carolina? I said, well, that's going to create gentrification. I mean, I get it, but then it's almost like a glorified rental unit in my view. So I just don't understand. This is where the policy folks, God bless y'all, have to figure it out and with the community. But I don't see how it's generating long-term wealth for the folks with the limited equity structure. The second thing I think we cannot forget is NYCHA. NYCHA is huge in Harlem, and I'm telling you right now, we're doing some of the preservation. People are living in horrible conditions. I mean, we're talking about all this stuff, like we want to green. I mean, it's like literally we've walked into places where there's our elderly people are like sitting in a rocking chair, hostage by rats running around their units. And this is what's happening, right, on the ground, right? So we have got to, I get rad, packed up, blah, 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 whatever. Our people are living in horrible conditions. Something needs to get done. NYCHA is clearly not doing it. I mean, so we love working with the tenant association leaders and presidents. They see black developers coming in, they're welcoming us in. They're like, yes, let's do it. And we're with them, and we may not agree on 100% of things, but we know that something's got to change, right? They're asking for security cameras, right? They're not afraid of the police. They actually want the police. They want people to come in to help things get more secure. Now, they don't want abuse of their kids, right? I don't think that's a if and or. So we got to focus on NYCHA, and we got to get to the bottom line and figure out how we're going to get all of those residents, a lot of them in Harlem, into better living conditions now.
Can I just respond to that real quick?
Yeah.
The NYCHA program, like a lot of other public, this country had a lot of amazing public programs. Public education was first in the world a couple generations ago. Public housing, which today is synonymous with poverty, was not the case. Public housing was built for the middle class, especially folks coming home from World War II. We had amazing public hospitals. Public was great after FDR a couple generations ago, but there has been a concerted effort made at the federal level and also at the state and city level to choke off the life supply of these programs. When you defund something, you drive it into the ground, you wind up with these horrific conditions. So instead of focusing on the symptom of the problem, we need to look more beyond the surface at the root causes of the problem and make sure that our senators, our Congress members, our president puts funding into these programs. Why are we spending so much money on war? This country, really, you know, and one of my closest friends is Ukrainian, but I'm sorry, it shouldn't be that we in Harlem have to starve, or in other communities have to starve so that we could perpetually be in war or other horrible situations that we shouldn't be in.
Can I just say really quickly
Sure.
on this? I don't disagree with you, but I do. Because first of all, public housing was for white people. It wasn't for us. So they invested in public housing to put white people and their families after the war. And honestly, black people were segregated away, and we lived in horrible, our public housing was always horrible. It was never good. It was the white folks' housing that was good. They moved out, they allowed us to move back in, and they said, okay, great, now we have to invest in it. The second thing is, like, we're not gonna get to a place, and this is where my practicality is, and I love people advocate for stuff, I get it. Like, we have Republicans, we have Democrats, we cannot count that every year the federal government is going to give as much money as we want to fix the housing. Even if we get it in 1 year because we got the people who we love, there's no guarantee we're going to get it 8 years from now or 4 years from now. We have to stop relying on the government to do this crap, guys. Come on. Like, at the end of the day, we have to figure out a way to fix a solution. We can't say, yes, I agree. If they could fund $2 trillion to public housing, now I wouldn't give it to NYCHA. I don't know who advocates for that. If we see what they've done, we can talk about how they're running stuff, and I'm working with NYCHA now, and I don't think they would disagree. But my point is, like, we cannot rely on consistent funding. It's not happening. But what we can say is the symptoms, which is these people are living horribly. And so we have to do something now about it. And the way we can do something now is funding programs where developers can get in who know what they're doing and try to make the situation correct. We can argue about who owns, who does, who's this and that, but we need to do something about the people who are living there, and NYCHA can't do it.
Well, I appreciate everybody's answers. We're going to cut to Q&A now, and then if we have time, we can go back. But I do want to note, particularly to Mr. Punter's point about the HDFC on 110th and the HDFC on 151st, buildings were never supposed to be worth anything in the 70s and 80s. They were negative assets, which is why they were abandoned. And so, as April Tyler argued vociferously time and time again, the city didn't have a problem turning these over to residents of Harlem. Actually, they didn't want to. They wanted to give them to developers. But when even developers balked, tenants eventually won the right to pick that. And, you know, and they weren't run as limited equity co-ops. They were run as limited income. So you could sell without a price cap, and there was a flip tax, and that was supposed to go back to the building in the city, and that eventually expired. But then, when Harlem suddenly became not Beirut and not something that people ran away from, that was recognized for what it was, which is a gem, and the city had a problem with black and brown people owning real estate in desirable neighborhoods, and that's when they began introducing these price caps and really effectively making it limited equity. So I feel remiss if I would let that go unexplained, because I know April would smack me. So I want to turn it over to Q&A now. We got a bunch of hands. I'm going to start with Michael since I saw his first. If we can start with Michael, because I put him off till the end and we're here now. So there's a mic coming, Michael.
What if this development you're talking about, how is that going to keep from displacing the very people who you say live in these terrible conditions? When they fix up those conditions and they're making it market rate and there's no flip tax, those people are just going to be displaced.
We're not doing that.
And moreover,
We're not doing that.
is no one utilizing the investment tax credit, the 25% investment tax credit? The National Historic Preservation Tax Credit? Not in Harlem. They do downtown all over the place, but not in Harlem. I don't understand it. And then finally, when you have these buildings which are not being invested in, how is it that you can compel the city and owners to do something? I mean, Virginia Fields is the person who was responsible for taking the city law, which said that if landlords defaulted on their taxes and didn't pay their water rates, then the city would take it over. And then Virginia Fields, as she was leaving office, she had the law changed so that those apartments then became bundled as financial instruments that are sold on Wall Street. How is that helping tenants?
So
I don't get it.
there were a couple questions embedded in there. I don't know if anyone wants. Karim, I saw you were.
I mean, first of all, we're not doing that. When we fix up 19 units, we're not making it market rate. It's absurd. Nobody's doing that. Let me.
No.
I answered your
Michael,
question.
let him answer.
Please, and let's move on, because bottom line is we're not doing that. I mean, and I get there are bad actors. There's bad actors everywhere, but I'm telling you right now, I'm preserving nicer housing. I'm not moving market rate people in there. I have in-place rehab, people who are living in squalor. I'm going into their units and I'm fixing them, and they're staying there. I'm telling you what I'm doing. Okay, that's one. Second thing is, I mean, when a building is in poor conditions, the way you fix it is you put responsible developers, right? When the city takes over land, what do you think happens to that building? It's horrible. It goes downhill. They don't know. They're horrible landlords at every level. They'll tell you that. So we have to take it out of city hands, and we have to find developers, community-based developers. This is what Malcolm was saying. Nonprofits, people who understand, have a long-term focus on the community, and we have to create financial sustainability, and we have to create affordability and maintain it. So when you get city money, we have to say, listen, you can't go market rate. You have to stay affordable at some AMIs. Now, we can argue. I'm not going to argue about what the AMI levels are. I get it. Some people want 30. Please,
Okay, Michael,
30, 50, 80, whatever it is. But my point is that whatever the city allows them to do, they're going to do. So your argument is with the city programs. If you want to make the city if you want to make the city.
Michael, I'm with you on the renting, but let's.
So I guess my point is
Yeah.
that's a new construction. That's not a preservation, right? So, but my point is that whatever their deed restriction is, right? If they're taking money from the city, they have some deal with the program terms that they have to live by. So what I'm saying to you, right? So my point is that that's a private deal, right?
The
So.
Memorial Church, the minister there took a kickback of $1 million, didn't tell his church, and then tore the building down. There's no building there.
Yeah.
I get what you're saying, but this is not.
Yeah, but Michael, I think to Mr. Hudson's point, we're talking about rehabilitation of existing historic housing, and in both instances, you've talked about landmark buildings or buildings that should have been landmarked or buildings that were landmarked and then were decalendared, that then got torn down and redeveloped. And while it is an outrageous things that happened and continue to happen, I do want to stick to the housing portion of this. There was a woman in green and red glasses, and if I'm not calling you by your name, please state it before you ask your question.
The woman in green and red glasses is fine.
And then there's a gentleman, and Simeon, if next we can do the gentleman in blue.
And I'm sorry, I'm only speaking, I'm not prepared to go up there, but representing the elected official who's not in the room, when maybe, that's good, perhaps. And I wish that I was on the panel, but I'm not here in that capacity because I have a lot of thoughts personally. But in any case, I send regrets on behalf of State Senator Cordell Clear, who, but for being in Albany literally till about 2:30 last night and 2:30 the night before, would be here. And so there's a letter that has been given to the moderator just expressing why she was not here, but for that, she would be here. So in any case, that's all I wanted to say.
Yes, and as I said before on the previous panel, we do not fault our state legislators for doing the job we elected them to do and pay them to do. So she's in Albany doing what we sent her there to do, and we're grateful for it. And I will read that letter at the end.
Yeah.
But, sir.
Yeah, hi. My name is Bill Bachman, and I have two questions, I guess. One is directed toward Tiffany, and that is when you, in your description of the vacant units, does that include the apartments that are rented under as Airbnbs? I know that's a whole other question then. And the second question, and maybe this is delusional, just what are the chances of actually reviving Mitchell-Lama so that Mitchell-Lama actually builds housing that is affordable for people who are like bus drivers, nurses, et cetera, et cetera?
So that's a very good question. And again, we can't create a policy and use a broad sweeping brush to apply that to everyone. Airbnb can be a life savior for the mom and pop landlord, especially the senior citizen who's on a fixed income. So in that case, by all means, allow her to use that. And no, I don't really count that. But in the case of landlords, again, like one of my previous landlords, who, by the way, had a building that was 25 units, entirely rent regulated until the fire eviction took place in 2014. After the fire, when he renovated the building, he proceeded to use Airbnb for some of the units downstairs. No, I don't think someone like that should be rewarded, especially because A, he's partly responsible for the fire, and B, because the tenants who wanted to move back in were essentially dissuaded or strong-armed into signing surrender agreements. So we cannot have policies that apply to everyone the same way. As for the Mitchell-Lama, that's something that's really heartbreaking in some cases. 3333 Broadway comes to mind. We all know about how those tenants were promised things that were not delivered, and now we see a lot of people moving into the building that, and I have no problems with people who are not from a neighborhood moving in. Migration, immigration, fine. But I do have a problem when people whose children or grandchildren cannot afford to continue living in those buildings. So we need to do something about those Mitchell-Lama buildings as well.
And I will just add context. 3333 was a Mitchell-Lama rental. Your rent was capped at a third of your income. It then went to Section 8. It's down now to 40% of people there in Section 8. 10 of them had lap leases, which I'm, 10 out of 1,192. I'm not counting. It's a big number. And a lot of the people who live there now in the market rate units are transient. They leave after 2 years. They're there for Columbia. They're there maybe for City College. They're there for whatever reason, and then they move out. And actually, you're finding that the landlord is realizing that the cost of that high turnover is actually not sustainable. So they're looking to enter into an agreement with the city that through an ECF owns the land under it because it's a school to try to come up with something more stable. So not only is it bad for the community, the tenants, everybody, turns out it's not a great model for the landlord either.
Yeah, I just wanted to address the tax credit question. I think tax credits are great, and any developer wants to get as much funding, whether it's investment or subsidy into a project. It reduces the the overall operating cost. But many times the federal programs can't be layered. So you either in a tax credit program or some other program, or a tax credit in Section 8 and rent stabilization, but you can't be in two tax credit programs at the same time. So, I'm not 100% positive about the historic tax credits relationship with, for example, low-income housing tax credits, but that's usually the problem. You can't double dip into a federal program at the same time.
So we have the gentleman there in the
Yes.
purple shirt. And
Hi.
you can state your name.
Yes, my name is Hannibal Ahmed. I'm a client support specialist at the Department of Housing Preservation and Development. I am a specialist in the Office of Neighborhood Strategies and Customer Service Office. I have a proposal that I put forth to HPD on the very issues that has grabbed the attention of the commissioner. And one of the elements of what I indicated in the proposal to the commissioner is that we have to go back to the 1619 project, and we have to go back to Michelle Alexander, the new Jim Crow, and we have to go back and re-examine the place of the stress syndrome that was reinforced through the last 250 years or so to understand why the government has not raised the consciousness of the people. Contrary to the point of view about the war, World War II, my dad was the military police, and when they were recruiting us for the NITRA developments in 1945 and in 1946, those developments were impeccably kept for veterans of the service. Lawns, security, the police stations were in the neighborhood. The Office of Neighborhood Strategies were operating very, very consistently. The theoretical framework of NITRA, or the city planners at that time, was that those who came from the war and came out of structured kinds of systems would be in those areas where the urban planners felt that the consciousness of those that were targeted to go into those NITRA development will raise the consciousness of the surrounding tenement area. The reverse happened to have been the effect as a result of the Korean War and the poppy and then the drugs that came in. The same thing happened when the March on Freedom, Jobs and Equality and Fair Housing in 1962 and 63 morphed into the March on Washington, and after the bump off of Kennedy, Johnson seized power, and when Johnson seized power, everybody made the reality of the power of the Kennedys and how every time someone comes to be a voice of the African American people, at that time the Negro people, something happens. And exactly pressured Johnson to sign that legislation that led to the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. And when that legislation was put into effect, the forces of the Confederacy in the FBI set up a strategy to go right to the point that she was making, where they pushed the war in Vietnam on the front line and pushed the war on poverty, the Great Society War on Poverty legislation, that if you need the details of that, Harvard University housing studies give you all of the archives.
Sir,
of
this
that.
is
And so the
important
question is,
context.
yes, I had to give that background. Again, I said I wrote a proposal that grabbed the attention of the new commissioner because I am talking about 100 years of this systematic pushback in the government of the United States of America. Okay, and the question is, how do we create videos, training programs like right here? How do we do that and begin to make that accessible for the masses of the people? How do we begin to raise the consciousness to let them know the impact of the systematic post-traumatic slave syndrome that they never address? And how do we use the forces of HPD, housing, preservation, and development to use and to make the government heal us from the 1619 period up until this very day. Heal us with your enormous resources, your enormous brilliant intelligences, your Office of Neighborhood Strategy throughout the 5 boroughs. How do you turn all of these into training program to heal us in this country? That's my question.
Beautiful question. Love it.
Do you want to take it?
I'll start with, you mind. Barbados was a plantocracy. It's where my family, I spent the first 5 years of my life there. And it was under the Queen's thumb until November of
2022?
2021. I was there when all the fanfare came about. And the one thing, my mother, who only has an 8th grade education at best, smart woman, and I stand on those shoulders, the one thing she always instilled in me from as long as I can remember is you're gonna open a bank account when you turn 8, which I did, and home ownership. Why are so many kids throughout Harlem, they don't think about owning at least the space that they live in, never mind investing in other property. Just the notion of owning the home, the 4 walls that you live in. Why are we constantly recipients? We're always either consumers or recipients. So it starts with each one teaching one. Talk to those kids that you're standing next to on a supermarket line or at the bus stop or on the subway. Ask them about that. Are you in arrears? Have you ever thought about maybe you can take over the building? It was done. People did it. How about what's going to happen after you can no longer work? Retirement savings. Financial literacy is not something that is taught. We have other courses that are compulsory in school. Maybe instead of defunding public education, we can invest more in public schools, or all of us right here in this room right now can do something when we walk out of that door by talking to kids. I had 50 kids at my doorstep at any given moment selling drugs. I have no problem. I love those kids, by the way, but I know that their schools are failing them, and the adults around them are failing them. So why not start a conversation? Ask them if they're 18, have you considered voting? And we know the response is going to be not just no, but it doesn't change anything. I can't blame them for feeling disillusioned, because we know a lot of our politicians are failing us, but that doesn't give us the luxury of throwing our hands up in the air or burying our heads in the sand. So my humble opinion is just on the ground talking to people of all ages, especially young people.
Before I pass to Mr. Punter, Mr. Hudson, I want to note, look around this room. Is this topic interesting to people in Harlem? If so, why is it not that every seat in this room is filled? And I want to confirm, I think we're going to have recordings or live stream online. If you know someone who's interested in this stuff that isn't in this room, make sure you get that link, make sure you send it to them, make sure they watch it, and then make sure they share it. And then make sure they take action based on what they're learning. Okay, so Mr. Hudson, Mr. Punter.
Yeah, obviously we're not really communicating very well with people, because there are financial literacy programs. In fact, HCCI has them embedded in all of its housing operations. We have wraparound services. In addition to that, the City of New York Housing Preservation and Development will underwrite our construction projects and preservation deals with what is called a social service reserve amount. And that's usually funding for a 10-year period from placed in service to make sure that the residents have access to social workers, financial literacy, and other education programs. Both Karim and I have those reserves in our buildings. And no, we can't just go withdraw the money out the bank account, because in order to access the reserves, we have to put a plan in place called a social service plan, and that plan has to be approved by the resident association, has to be approved by HPD, and has to be approved by the funding sources for the construction and preservation of those buildings. That's been in place for at least 10 years in all of the preservation deals that we operate. So we do have wraparound services. And literally, HCCI's first-time homebuyer program, which is a monthly education seminar, 4 modules, you can finish it in 1 month, has 90 to 100 people from Harlem in those classes. In person, virtual, COVID, people are interested in buying their homes. So this idea that somehow black people are not educated and don't see the value of intergenerational wealth building and purchasing a home is a false narrative. People are interested, and they are. In addition to that, HPD through the advocacy of HCCI and other CBOs and elected officials, mandated or required that the city update their first-time home buyers grant funding for people who finish that class and they become eligible to purchase a first-time home. It used to be a grant of $40,000. Now it's a grant of 20% of the purchase price of the unit up to $500,000. What is 20% of $500,000? $100,000. You can get that as free money if you take the program and buy in a qualified census tract, LMI census tract, and we're producing the units. I already told you, we're producing 300 co-ops in the community. And regarding the Mitchell-Lama program, I was my parents moved into the Mitchell-Lama program that was created day one, and they've probably paid into that cooperative Mitchell-Lama program over $500,000 of their lifetime earnings over a 50-year period. And they have nothing but a piece of paper that's worth nothing. That's a failure. It's a poverty program. That money that they've put into that program for 50 years should have turned into equity. So the Mitchell-Lama program, while it's good in stabilizing middle-class housing, it's a failure in building wealth. So that has to be reconstituted and modified. I agree it should be restructured, but it should be restructured so that people can have a generational wealth. And finally, black people are not in New York by choice. Mm-hmm. We were forced out of the South to come to New York. So why can't someone who lived their life because of Jim Crow decide to move back down South, and that's a problem? They should be moving back down South with some equity so that they can buy property that was stolen from them in the first place. So don't blame the victim.
Thank you. Mr. Hudson, and
say,
then I'm going to pass it back to Tiffany for one thing.
Okay, and I will just say, I love what Tiffany had to say. I love that Malcolm, this is my guy, he's getting a little animated, I love it. Listen, I'm a black developer, I live in these streets. People come up to me all the time, tell me what I'm doing wrong, tell me what I'm doing right. I personally put my office in one of the worst blocks that my company owns. I'm there every day, in that office. When I first went there, the guys were on the stoop smoking, the guys were outside. You know what? Let me just give you an example of what happened. I left my key in my office door in that worst block. The woman from upstairs, who's like the neighborhood whatever, took that key out the lock, walked to my management office, said, you know that guy who goes downstairs all the time? He left this key in his door. I didn't even know. I went back to my office a week later. I was like, I got my key. My management team called me, your key is here, Karim. It's like, what? Yeah, such and such brought it down. So we have great hearts. We are the most benevolent, loving people, right? And I'm not afraid to talk about the issue. I'm not afraid to talk to the guy off the stoop. Hey, man, can you stop smoking? Okay, it's 3 a.m. I love you. You can call the police. Screw you. I'm not leaving. I said, listen, I'm not going to call the police. I'm your neighbor. But I'm asking you to please respect the fact that, it's loud, right? And we're trying to, do some stuff here. And you know what? They argue with me, then they went away. Right now, so interacting, being a part of it, I'm a bad developer, whatever, but, this is what you get when you get people who have the right values, who are from the community, who want to build. And it's good for them to have their home ownership and also have other properties. That's the intention. And brother, I love you, but I just don't trust any government institution to be doing the right thing when it comes to giving black folks or brown folks a leg up. All those institutions, I just know from the color of law, and maybe I'm completely wrong, all those institutions were built to segregate, right? And I have never seen, and this goes back to Thurgood Marshall, segregation end up with equality. And so I can't put my faith that that's going to happen, even though I hope it does.
So I'm going to call on the woman in gray in the middle there in just a moment, but one follow-up to what Mr. Punter said. Tiffany, you attempted to take advantage of the new homeownership program at HPD, right?
Yeah.
What is the wait time to actually get that?
4 to 6 months. Now, let's be honest. If you have a seller who's trying to get rid of that property for whatever reason, do you really think they're going to wait for you to get it together in 6 months?
And that was the
And that's
topic.
not counting all the plethora of other problems
So-
with this program.
So HPD can do better, and I know they can. And I'm going to do something very selfish, for which I hope you will forgive me.
Home First Down Payment Assistance Program. Yeah, 6 month
Yeah, the
application waiting.
bureaucracy. And
Yes.
the lack of staffing. But I wanna do something very selfish. So Ewan, I'm sorry, but Tiffany Kahn was on Community Board 9 until a month ago when she was not reappointed. And if you think that the voice you've heard today from Tiffany Kahn is one that should be on the community board, if you could give a round of applause, that would be lovely. Because it is a very important voice that we lost, and I'm sure she'll be at our meetings anyway as a public member, but it's not fair. It's not fair to the board, it's not fair to you. Anyway, sorry, soapbox off. And now with the glasses and the gray, if you could state your name.
Noah Miller. I don't necessarily have a question, but just kind of a comment. I am a student at Pratt, and I was able to go to Cuba during the spring break. And I learned that I think it was June 16th or June 17th of 2021, they wrote into their constitution the right of housing and the fact that every single Cuban student, Cuban national, has a right to housing and has that right protected through the government. And I think in the conversation about issues of gentrification, about issues of displacement, and also just the lack of dignifiable and humane housing, the issue is the fact that we have a lack of a right to housing and that it's not protected. So people are living in these conditions that are deplorable, that they are really not able to live a full, successful, sustainable life, but it's because they have no other option, they have no way to leave, that even if they do own their housing because of these caps, because of these issues, even if they sell it, they don't necessarily have the equity to be able to go somewhere and do something different. And I think with gentrification, the issue is just a lack of choice. And people are not able to decide for themselves where they want to go, what that housing looks like. My family is nomadic, we move all the time, and it's because of just that lack of stability, that lack of my parents being able to actually find something that is worthwhile, that gives me and my siblings access to education. So I first want to say thank you for saying that we should be able to move if we want to. We should be able to go to the South and claim that land that was rightfully stolen from us. Not rightfully, but was stolen from us, that we rightfully should be able to gain access to. But I think the conversation around housing really has to talk about the fact that we do not have a right to it, and in no way, shape, or form is it protected. And that should be something that we should be working on.
So since that was not a question, I'm going to jump to the last one, the last person I'm calling on, because I think it's 12:30.
Thank you for that comment.
Is the woman in turquoise with the headband next to Walter Alexander? And if you could state your name.
Yes, hello, my name is Margaret Blair, and thank you so much for being here. I love education, and I just love what everybody said. I want to direct my question to maybe Mr. Punter and maybe Tiffany. I care so much about these issues, but I'm interested more in the bottom line. At the end of the day, who exactly is going to do the research and hold who accountable, right? Because we have these questions, and it's not ethereal. It's not up in the air. We have elected officials who are affiliated with so many people here. And at the end of the day, Mr. Punter, as you said, these issues come down to inequities, and you can document them, and we can complain all day. But I'm just interested in the bottom line. Who do we hold the feet to the fire to? Who do we keep the pressure on? Who do we address directly, and in terms of all this talk about re-elections and deselections on boards, who exactly do we go after or knock on the doors incessantly?
I think that for the city of New York, the buck stops at the mayor. I'm on a task force, affordable housing task force for faith-based institutions, and it's a collaborative of different houses of worship and leaders in that the faith community. And we met with the mayor at City Hall at his invitation. Gil Monroe being the leader of the faith-based initiative at the City Hall, and the mayor said to he heard us out. We want to produce more housing, particularly home ownership for our community. We need your help, Mr. Mayor. And as politicians do, they said, well, you give me a plan. So we did. We gave him a plan of action, and that plan of action, of course, is being reviewed by all the city's attorneys. That's the way bureaucracy works. You provide a framework, provide a roadmap, and then they're just embedded with the attorneys, and it never goes nowhere. But things go wrong, then they look for the local organizations to blame or someone else. The politicians are usually just make it out without any harm to them in terms of their political career. So I think the path forward is to develop those strategies and assign, like you said, folks to do the work. I've already volunteered for that assignment, and other of my colleagues have volunteered for the assignments, etc. The second part, I'm a researcher, so I'm a doctoral researcher. So I use my doctorate to research in housing as well as health disparities, working with the City University School of Public Health on the Harlem Strong Initiative. The Harlem Strong Initiative is a mental health and wellness strategies research program. We're training community health workers and social workers that provide services to the residents in our building to be able to identify depression and anxiety indicators. All of them were ballooned out of control. We did a survey during COVID.
Mr. Punter,
people are in fear.
I'm getting the
for
hook
mental
from
health.
John.
So research, practical. I volunteered. We're on the ground. We're going to do the work.
Tiffany, Mr. Hudson, and then I'm going to read Cordell's
I just want
letter,
to say
and we're
real quick to the student from Pratt, and also one of the points that you made about the right to move back to the South. Absolutely. People should have the right to move wherever they want. At the same time, people should have the right to stay if they so choose. And that is kind of one of the concerns, that it's not so much that grandma wants to go back to the South, it's that grandchild who's made a home for herself here cannot do so. We have a right to shelter in New York City, which is enormously profitable because it's always more profitable to, the poor are lucrative, right? It costs more money to put a person in a shelter than it does to keep them in their homes. And this key in the door thing that you mentioned, story, is a wonderful story. Jane Jacobs gives a story in her book, The Life and Death of American Cities, where she talks about a little girl who was being accosted on the street by someone, and everyone, the butcher, the neighbor came out, and they weren't having it. But this is what happens when you have communities, not transient people that don't care or don't know what's happening. And there was one more thing, I think it was about the HPD grant, and it doesn't matter if it's an HPD grant or whatever grant, it doesn't matter if it's a policy or whatever it is. Something can be wonderful in theory, but the implementation is terrible. And so to your point about accountability, yes, it never stops. We cannot pop that bottle just because we got something passed. We have to continuously research and be dogged about it, be pit bulls about it, and make sure that things are being done the way that they should be. We need third parties to be doing it too. The fox should not be guarding the hen house, and there are too many examples of that.
So Tiffany, I'm going to ask Mr. Hudson, and then...
I think at the end of the day, the accountability falls with us as a community. We have to hold ourselves accountable. We have to do a better job of picking our leaders. We have to reimagine what leadership looks like in our communities. We were always looking at the historical models. We have to say, hey, going forward, what does this really look like? How we hold people accountable? We're doing the same thing, and it's not changing. I think other communities are doing a better job of talking to their elected officials and getting results. And I think that's because they have a different way of organizing themselves. And so I think we got to look at ourselves and say, are we doing this right? And we got to reimagine, re-envision.
Applause, please. And I'm going to read the letter from Senator Clare, which just says, "Dear friends, I would like to extend my sincere apologies for not being able to participate in this year's Historic Preservation Conference at City College, Spitzer School of Architecture. Unfortunately, due to the extended legislative session in Albany, I am unable to attend the event as originally planned. Harlem, with its rich history, vibrant culture, and diverse community, serves as a shining example of the strength and resilience found within our city. However, it is not exempt from the challenges posed by rapid development and escalating housing costs. It is crucial that we unite in our determination to preserve the essence of Harlem while simultaneously addressing the urgent need for affordable housing. Although I cannot be physically present at the panel, I want to assure you that I will continue to work tirelessly in Albany to support initiatives that promote affordable housing and preserve our city's cultural and historic heritage. I offer my best wishes for a successful panel discussion and trust that it will generate valuable insights and ideas to tackle the challenges we face in the realm
Breathe,
of
Barry.
affordable housing and historic preservation. Thank you for your understanding, and I look forward to collaborating with you in the future. Sincerely, Senator Cordell Clare."
First, I want to balance. I came to Harlem in 1980 to hear Mr. Punter and all the work that was done and what the neighborhood looked like in 1980 and what the local faith-based and other institutions did around development. And I always tell people, for me, Harlem is a brand greater than Chanel. And no, really, you go anywhere in the world, and the sadder thing of all this conversation to me, we can spend time picking the mistakes that the local development groups made, or all these different issues, but we've had excellent examples of everything we've just talked about. We have produced some excellent examples of all these different things and why we don't have broader visibility for what we accomplished over that time. And these people actually leading the conversation of what the next level should be. There's a range of different points of view here, but there's also this range of excellence that's been, and it's not out there in the world in terms of understanding what we really did do. And bringing that money, all those developers that partnered with you, those groups, where are they now, those early developers at the top of the heap? And no mayor has made them come back and reinvest in the development corporations. Didn't make them, because they're still there managing the buildings and all that. And I think we do a disservice to our community not to step back, and even we have issues amongst one another about the excellent work that people came and did that were from other places or from here to make the neighborhood as stable as it is today, and giving a voice to that, whether it's a forum like this or through the mayor's office or at the national level. We have to figure out a way to get the word out, because we have done some amazing things. So thank you, guys.